This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Beginning today's show is Eric Ward, Kansas Forest Service Assistant Fire Management Officer, to remind us of fire dangers around barns and homes that people might have forgotten about. K-State weed specialist Sarah Lancaster continues the show by discussing rye and the issues and benefits it can bring to crop producers. We're also joined by K-State row crop plant pathology specialist Rodrigo Onofre as he discusses soil testing for soybean cyst nematodes. Nuisance pests are making their way into homes, and K-State horticultural entomologist Raymond Cloyd completes the show today by explaining how to control these pests. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Thursday show with a few things people might want to consider when it comes to fire safety. And to talk about it, we're joined with the Kansas Forest Service Assistant Fire Management Officer, Eric Ward. Eric, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me on.
So as we're talking about fire and maybe a few things people kind of need to keep in mind this time of year, and the first one being heat lamps.
This is the time of year where we start pulling out heating devices to warm ourselves or warm our pets, our livestock, or whatever. And any kind of heating device is a potential source for fires. In a prior career, I was a fire chief for 20 years and worked a number of fires through the years that were directly caused by somebody trying to provide heat for their pets or livestock, and either the animal got something up against the heat source or knocked it over or something like that, and the results were rarely positive for the animals involved.
With heat lamps, what are a few considerations that people should keep in mind if they're wanting to use them?
Well, make sure it's someplace where the animals can't knock it over, and that it's in a secure location, that it's not right up against anything flammable. It's not going to overheat something. Not uncommon to have hay or something like that in a dog house or an animal pen for the animals. Make sure that the heat lamp is not in a position to get that particularly hot. You want it to warm things, but you don't want it to get too hot.
And another thing, thinking of agriculture, is machines, and especially a lot of places are really dry this year.
We've had some areas that have had some really good moisture, but we're still technically in a pretty substantial drought across most, if not all, of the state. So even with rains, things are very dry. And the conditions are such that it might be much easier to ignite a fire than what it normally would be.
And sometimes producers are purposefully lighting things on fires when it comes to things like bonfires and brush fires. However, there's a few considerations that people really need to keep in mind when it comes to those type of fires.
Yeah, we typically encourage people, or historically have encouraged people, if they're going to burn a brush pile or a debris pile, to do it when there's snow on the ground. It's much less likely that blowing embers and things like that would start a fire. One problem that we have seen several times in recent years with the extended drought and unusually dry conditions is that, and this isn't unusual, but any kind of debris pile can hold heat for a long time. Just your typical household or farmstead brush pile can potentially smoke for days. I watched a really large brush pile near Manhattan a couple of years ago that literally for weeks, every time I drove by, it was still smoking because of the amount of material in it. And if there's still heat in it and the weather changes, you may burn on a really, really good day with lots of snow on the ground, but a week later, it's warmed up, it's dry, it's windy, and embers can blow out and cause fires. And we've seen that, including with some pretty tragic consequences in recent years.
So even though that there might not be a flame anymore, there could still be a fire from it?
Yeah, if there's any warmth, if there's smoke coming out of it, there is still a potential, and you need to continue to monitor that very closely and monitor the weather. If it's turning into a hot, dry situation, as they say in Kansas, if you don't like the weather, it's going to change soon. You may burn on a perfect day, but a few days later may be really dangerous fire conditions, and just need to stay on top of that.
And maybe not so much for a brush fire, but for a bonfire, maybe taking the time to pour a fair amount of water on it and raking in those coals.
We always, when you're teaching about campfires and stuff, part of the deal is to soak it down, work through it. With campfires, it was always taught, even as far back as when I was in Boy Scouts, to actually run your hands through the coals. And if it's too hot for your hand, it's too hot. Make sure it's completely out, wet, stirred before you leave it and assume it to be over.
And something else with fires, when it's cold, a lot of people like to start up their fireplaces and have that sense of warmth. And before they maybe even start it, a few things people should do.
Fireplaces are wonderful. We enjoy the warmth. We enjoy the atmosphere they provide, but they can also be a significant source of fire potential. The chimney is one of the first things. Anytime it's getting to be fireplace and heating season, it's good to have the chimney professionally inspected and potentially cleaned. Professional chimney sweep can make sure that the chimney's in good shape. It doesn't have cracks. It hadn't shifted and created gaps or whatever. I saw a fire one time where a beautiful rock chimney was poorly done in the attic and had gaps, and an ember blew out into the attic and caused substantial damage. Bird nests, wasp nests, stuff like that in the chimney could be a fire source. And then the buildup from the smoke is the source of most chimney fires. When a fire burns, it creates all kinds of byproducts, obviously, and part of the smoke is creosote. And as that smoke rises through the chimney, the cooler walls of the chimney cause the creosote to precipitate out against the walls and build up. In a good hot fire, not much will happen with that. There's enough heat and enough updraft to carry that smoke away. In a smoky or a smaller fire, that smoke rises more slowly and more of that creosote can build up inside the chimney, and a chimney sweep can resolve that pretty quickly. But if you let that stuff build up, it can be a source for a chimney fire, and a good going chimney fire is like a blowtorch coming out the top of the house.
Eric, is it fair to say then that in a fireplace, having a controlled, more intense fire can be a good thing?
Yeah, actually, it's counterintuitive. It seems wrong that a bigger fire might be safer, but in the case of a fireplace, burning a small, cool, smoky fire creates more buildup faster than a good hot fire that creates a really good draft up through the chimney. Plus, the hotter fire is just burning cleaner and more efficiently.
And something that is obviously needed for a fireplace working is some firewood. However, there are different types of firewood that can create different reactions.
Yeah, there's all kinds of different wood. Some of it burns hotter, some of it burns cooler, some wood is smokier than others. Some of the real pitchy woods tend to put out more smoke that leads to more buildup in the long term. Not a problem on a specific given fire, but over time will coat the chimney more. Some woods tend to have more potential to pop and create embers and throw sparks and stuff, which is a really good reason to make sure that you've got a good screen across the front of the fireplace. That will stop the vast majority of anything that might pop, or glass doors, or the metal door on a wood stove that you would shut. People might want to leave that door open just to enjoy the glow of the fire, but a wood stove is not meant to be run with the door open. You don't get the same efficiency of heat, and you don't have anything to stop that ember from flying out, or even the wood from shifting and a whole log rolls out.
And on thinking of fireplaces, the ashes eventually have to come out of the fireplace, and is there a way that people should take the time to dispose of them properly?
When you scoop your ashes out, they need to go into a metal container, something that's non-flammable. And then a couple choices. One is you can drown them, fill that container with water so everything's swimming, would make it pretty safe. The other is to put that metal container someplace where nothing will burn. Set it in the driveway with a metal cover on it, or someplace that there isn't anything there for it to light. I've seen fires more than once where the fireplace ashes were put in a plastic bucket up against the back of the house or in the garage or someplace. And again, I'm sure the people thought they were out, but it's just not a chance worth taking. A metal bucket and then put it someplace there's no chance to spread.
And a fireplace is something that can create heat for a house. However, some people also use space heaters.
Space heaters are a biggie. You see them pretty much everywhere you go. And again, they're made to heat. And if you look at them, most of them have some sort of a heating element in them that's glowing red hot and could light just about anything on fire. Several important things with that. First, make sure you're using one that's UL rated or is approved by a testing lab like Underwriter Laboratories or something. And that'll be on the label and on the packaging when you buy it. Space heaters should never be plugged into extension cords or power strips. They're a fairly high electric use item. And a lot of extension cords and power strips are not rated for that current and can cause the power strip or the cord to melt down or overheat and cause a fire. The other big, probably the most common misuse of space heaters is putting them too close to stuff. I believe fire codes typically require that they're 3 feet from anything that could ignite, which means under the desk, next to the bed, places like that are not appropriate. And I would say it's very, very common to see them in those situations.
Something then that's not as much for warmth as it is for creating aesthetic is a candle, and that little flame can do a lot if it's not attended to.
And that's probably one of the easiest ones to forget. And to be honest, I've done it. Light a candle because you like the smell of it, and it's just pleasing to have around, and go run errands and come back and, oh my gosh, that candle's still going. And hadn't caused any big problems, but it can and it does at different times cause real issues for people because it's just such an easy one to forget about. And as that candle burns down, it may be in a good container, but if it's on a flammable surface and burns down to nothing or tips over, the cat knocks it over or whatever, bad things can happen pretty quickly.
Unfortunately, while we don't want bad things to happen, sometimes they do just happen. And so, should people take the time to put together a fire safety plan? And if so, what should be included in it?
Absolutely. Every household should take some basic precautions for fire safety. We all think it'll never happen to us, but every home should have smoke detectors, lots of information online. A local fire department is always happy to help with information on that, but at least on every level of the house, plus in sleeping areas, hallways, bedrooms. Most smoke detectors now come with a 10-year battery, but that means you got to make a note somewhere in 10 years to replace them. Don't have to be quite as worried about replacing them all the time like we used to, but they should be tested regularly. Then having fire extinguishers in the house and knowing how to use them is very important. The other big thing is make sure everybody in the house knows a couple ways to get out. Human nature being what it is, if there's an emergency, we tend to always go out the way we came in. Even though you may be sitting 5 feet from a fire exit, you're going to go out that main front door that's 100 yards away. It's just how we think. Make sure everybody knows 2 ways out. And very important, make sure everybody knows where to go when they get out. There's been many tragic situations through the years, and I'm not quoting any specific ones here locally, but through the years, historically, there's been a lot of tragic situations where parents or grandparents have died in fires because they went back in for kids who are already safely in the backyard. They think their kids haven't gone out. They've gone in after them. Who of us wouldn't? I mean, I would give my life trying to save my kids if I thought they were inside. But tragically, a lot of times they've already gotten out. So the best way to avoid that is to make it really clear to everybody that when there's a fire or we have to evacuate, this is where we're going. We're all going to gather at this spot. And my suggestion is at the end of the driveway where it hooks to the street, because that gives you a spot close by that everybody can get to quickly. It's also the place where the fire trucks are going to show up. So when they get there, you can tell them, hey, everybody's out, just deal with the burning house. Or you can say, we're missing one, and here's where we think they are. So it'll help everybody to have that meeting place that everybody gathers, and you can be sure that everybody's out.
That was Assistant Fire Management Officer with the Kansas Forest Service, Eric Ward. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show now discussing cover crops and specifically rye. And then to talk about it, we're joined with K-State Weed Extension Specialist, Sarah Lancaster. Sarah, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Sarah, this time of year, producers could be thinking about cover crops.
So it is the season for planting cool season crops, and at least here in Manhattan, we've had a few rains that have got people at least a little more optimistic about putting in fall crops, and so it's a good time to talk about covers.
Specifically then looking at rye as a cover crop and why that might be a concern.
From a weed scientist's perspective, rye is my favorite cover crop. But often when I give extension presentations about rye, Shelby, I kind of try to joke with the audience that rye should really be a 4-letter word in some parts of the state. I know there's probably lots of farmers listening to this that spent a lot of their formative years walking wheat fields and roguing cereal rye, feral rye out of wheat fields. There's 2 sides to every coin, right? And so the weed management perspective, the good side to rye is that you can plant it, it establishes fall or spring, grows fast, really hardy, produces lots of biomass, which is what we want to suppress the weeds. But it can also cross-pollinate with wheat. It can be a terrible problem for foreign material in weeds. And from a weed control perspective, the big problem is that there are really very, very limited herbicide options for controlling cereal rye as a weed in a winter wheat crop.
Rye and wheat can have a little bit of a similar look. So, Sarah, how do you go about identifying the difference?
They're both cool season grasses, so they both have that twist in the leaf. They're both going to emerge in, late fall, early spring. But there are some good differences to use. When they're seedlings, when they're small, one thing you can do is if you have a really trained eye, the rye is typically going to look a little bluer than wheat. So that little bit of a bluer color can be one thing. The other thing to look at, when we identify grasses, we look really close at the collar region. So that's where the leaf blade attaches to the stem. If you look at the collar region of wheat, it's going to have what we call auricles, and they sort of look like little fingers that wrap around the wheat. So in wheat, they're not super big, but they're there and they're prominent and you can see them. Rye does not have auricles like wheat does. So that'll be one distinguishing characteristic. Once you get further into the spring and the plants start to elongate, rye is going to get much taller. The wheat varieties that we grow are semi-dwarf, and so they stay shorter. And then if you look at the head, rye heads will be longer and flatter than wheat heads. And similarly, the seeds are going to be kind of longer and skinnier compared to wheat. The rye seeds also, to me, have sort of an olive green cast over the brown, whereas our wheat varieties are going to generally have a redder color on the seeds. So those would be some kind of quick things that folks could use to distinguish between rye and wheat throughout the different growth stages.
And Sarah, what impacts then can it have on wheat?
So because they are so closely related, rye is going to compete very fiercely with a wheat crop. So you're going to see significant yield reductions. And then, again, as I put my farmer hat on, one of the things that I'm really thinking about is the fact that I can't clean that cereal rye out of the wheat as it goes through my combine. So I take that load of wheat into the elevator to sell it, and I'm going to get a big FM dock potentially if I have a lot of rye in my wheat seed. And so the millers don't want that, right? So think about the differences in the bread properties and the milling and the baking properties of rye versus hard red winter wheat. And so when we think about where our wheat is going, there's a reason why we have docks for that at the elevator.
And so management for rye is a really important thing, depending on how you're wanting to use your cereal rye.
Right. So as we think about managing for controlling cereal rye, the number one thing we need to do is just prevention. Because, again, there really are very limited herbicide options. So, anecdotally, talked to folks who were fairly certain it came from maybe contamination in a dry fertilizer spreader that had previously been used to spread cover crops. So, checking that kind of equipment. If you do use a drill to seed cover crops and wheat, making sure you've got your drill cleaned out well. Any point of contamination in the process is going to be so very important for farmers that are trying to manage both of these crops in the fall.
Sarah, so for those producers who may have contamination in their wheat field, how do they get rid of it?
Chemically, the only real options for us are herbicide-tolerant wheat varieties. So the older of those would be the Clearfield varieties. So there's a handful of those on the market. The herbicide you use in those is Beyond. And I think it's important to recognize that if you're going to use that system to try to target cereal rye control, the best bet is to make a fall application of the herbicide as well as a spring application. So you need to plan on a 2-pass program there, with the appropriate adjuvants, including a nitrogen fertilizer. So that's, I guess, the one kind of saving grace there is that you can double up with the herbicide and your fertilizer application. The other option for herbicide-tolerant wheat varieties would be coaxium wheat varieties, and the herbicide we use there is aggressor. The active ingredient is quizalofop. Quizalofop is a grass killer. So of the two systems, quizalofop is going to be rated higher for control of cereal rye compared to Beyond. So if you're targeting a cereal rye problem, coaxium wheat is probably going to be a better solution for you than Clearfield. And from my perspective as a wheat scientist, right, these are the types of situations where these herbicide-resistant wheat varieties really fit. So that coaxium system can do a nice job for us. There's some data that was collected from Great Bend, and really whether they use 10 or 12 ounces of aggressor, and regardless of which adjuvant option they went with, they got really good control, greater than 90% control of the cereal rye in the wheat. The other caveat to think about there is it's a grass killer. It's not going to control broadleaves. If you have a henbit problem or a mustard problem, and you want to use, for example, a 2,4-D, that's going to be tricky because we do have antagonism when we try to mix a product like 2,4-D with a herbicide like aggressor. So if you're using the coaxium system and you're going to use aggressor herbicide to control a problem grass, but you also have some broadleaves to worry about, applications start to stack up just because of tank mix concerns, potentially.
That was K-State wheat specialist Sarah Lancaster. We're now going to be joined by K-State row crop plant pathology specialist Rodrigo Onofre. Rodrigo, right now, people might be thinking about soybean cyst nematode sampling and testing, and why is that?
Soybean cyst nematode, it's a major problem for us across the soybean region production. So right now, it's the best time to think about it. We're planning for the 2024 season. So if you have anything to do or plan ahead of the time, now is the time to sample.
And the reason for sampling is the soybean cyst nematodes can create some problems for soybeans.
We can see lower yields depending on the population, and typically we don't see a visual symptom when we're out there during the season. Sometimes you see a little bit of stunted plants, yellowish discoloration. It's a really hard to diagnose in season, right? So sampling is essential for a good management.
Rodrigo, you recently did some work on this to kind of understand how prevalent it is and where it is in Kansas.
So what we found is SCN is present in about 62 counties here in Kansas, and those 62 counties are responsible for about 85% of the total soybean that is produced here by our growers. And what we have seen is a shift from the eastern part of the state to the central part of the state. So the hot spots right now, not that they're not in the eastern part of the state, where we're starting to find more and more high levels of SCN on that central, south central part of the state.
How do they actually get to sample the product?
It's a very typical soil fertility test, if you think about that way. You're going to need your soil probe, a bucket, and a labeled bag, which it should include as much information as possible, such as field identification in case we have to apply any management for that specific field, the size of the area that's being sampled, as well as crop rotation, just to let us know a little bit more about the history on that field.
And is there kind of a pattern in a field that producers need to follow when sampling?
It would be good to have that Z pattern where you're collecting multiple samples, and we say about 10 to 20 samples per field that's being sampled. And that field, typically, if I had to pick a number, would be about 20 acres. I know sometimes a field might represent more than that, but just for the sampling purpose, if you're really trying to pin down where SCN is present in your field, 20 acres is always a good number to start with.
And if people are a little confused about how to sample it, are there resources they could go to learn a little bit more information?
The Soybean Cyst Nematode Coalition, they have a lot of resource available to our growers here in Kansas. And as well, we have a YouTube video demonstrating how to sample for soybean cyst nematode with more details on it.
And there are a few really important factors for people to keep in mind when it comes to sampling and having that ready to ship off and go.
So nematodes, it's always good to avoid leaving in the dash of your truck, but we want to make sure that that sample gets to the lab in a fast way so we can start working on that analysis.
Where's a lab people could send their samples to?
It's always good to work with your K-State extension agents. They will help you either to sample or to help send those samples to the K-State Plant Diagnostic Lab here at K-State.
What is the fee for sending samples here to K-State?
So if you're doing with our K-State crop agents, the sample fee would be $25 per sample. And if you're external, it would be $35 per sample.
That was K-State row crop plant pathology specialist Rodrigo Onofre. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be back with more ahead.
This is Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. With cooler temperatures settling in across Kansas, K-State horticultural entomologist Raymond Cloyd says that homeowners shouldn't be too surprised to start seeing some nuisance pests inside the home. He also says it's time to start cleaning up the debris in the home landscape and vegetable gardens. Raymond, with the change in the weather, we're also seeing a lot of nuisance pests that come into the house. What are we specifically seeing this time of year?
Yeah, this is the time of year, Jeff, when we start seeing the Asian ladybird beetle, which is always prevalent. They'll come on the south side of a building, sun themselves, and then they'll come in. A box elder bug, crickets, and others. We call these nuisance pests. They come in, they're not going to cause any harm. They're just trying to find protection for the wintertime. The best way to deal with Asian ladybird beetle is to spray like a pyrethroid-based insecticide to repel them, or you can vacuum them up. Once they're inside, they tend to reside on the south side of a building, congregating in the corners of window seals. And you can vacuum them up and then put them outside. There's no need to spray. We don't recommend it. There's no need to spray. They're just really going to sit there and use up all their metabolic energy until the spring when they want to be active. They'll start moving around. That's really the best way to deal with Asian ladybird beetles. Once they're inside, just vacuum up and then put them outside. In fact, there's some pretty good studies that have come out of Ohio ever since the introduction of this insect in the 1980s. It was brought here to deal with the pecan aphid down in Georgia. Homes are a lot cleaner because people are vacuuming the windows. But yeah, if you have any questions, you can always contact the Department of Entomology at Kansas State. But that's really the best means or strategies to deal with it.
People may also be seeing some insects on the flowering mums.
Yes, what we're seeing, this is the year for fall mums, chrysanthemums, and there's an insect called the spotted cucumber beetle. It's related to the striped cucumber beetle, and it is feeding on the flowers. If you go out there and notice your flowers are chewed upon, you'll see this insect, yellow-green with black dots, spots, markings on the abdomen. That's the spotted cucumber beetle. And the best way to deal with it is either just hand pick them, vacuum them, whatever. You could have sprayed an insecticide as long as it doesn't harm the flowers, but they're out right now feeding on chrysanthemum flowers.
And they will cause damage.
They cause substantial damage in high numbers. In fact, we've seen chrysanthemums that, basically have lost their aesthetic appeal because of the damage caused by the adults.
Also time to maybe catch up on some of the bagworms.
Yes, this is the time of year to go out there and hand pick or hand remove the female bags. Now remember, if you see bags with a brown papery case protruding from the bottom, that's a male. There's no eggs there. Remember that bagworms overwinter as eggs, and each bag with a female can contain between 500 to 1,000 eggs. So if you've got a weekend, you've got nothing to do, go out there for a couple hours and just take the bags, put them in some soapy water, about a 1 to 10 solution, let them sit there for about 15 minutes, and then dump it out into an area where there's full sun. And that usually kills them. So you pick the bags off, but you still got to kill the caterpillars inside the bags, and that's why you put them in some soapy water to do that, and then dump them out in a hot area where it just kind of heats them up. Or you can put them in a plastic bag, seal it, and put it out in the sun, and that will kill them. At least the caterpillars will not leave the plastic bag.
The other thing to think about right now is also just make sure that you're removing debris.
Yes, this is the time of year, primarily in vegetable gardens and even in ornamentals, landscapes, is removing any debris, leftover plant material, some leaves, because these are areas where a number of insects can overwinter. For vegetable gardens, squash bug overwinters as an adult, color a potato beetle, asparagus beetle. They will use debris to overwinter. So removing it will remove the hiding places. Certain insects will overwinter leaves. I know people use that for mulch. You can shred it, use it in your compost pile or whatever. But sanitation, of course, is the first line of defense against any insect mite and even disease problems. So removing this debris, especially in vegetable gardens, tomatoes, old peppers, whatever, remove them, get them out of there. And that will alleviate, not eliminate, but alleviate potential problems for next year.
Always have a lot of fact sheets available, or they can also contact just their local extension office.
Yes, they can contact their local extension office. They can access the KSU bookstore for extension publications. We have publications on almost all of the insect pests related to landscapes, gardens, livestock, and field crops. So you just get online or contact your extension office, and they could provide information on how to obtain an extension publication like on squash bug or any of the numerous pests that are a problem in horticultural cropping systems.
That's K-State horticultural entomologist Raymond Cloyd. Again, for more information, contact your local extension office. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.